Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming along. Today I'm going to speak to you about the Met Office in the post-war years, and specifically about the emergence of public weather services here and commercial weather services as well. I'm going to focus on a few specific developments, a few specific case studies, but I'm more than happy to expand on anything at the end if anyone has any questions or wants to know a little bit more about certain areas. And I'm going to presume in the room that we have a huge varying degree of knowledge about the history of the organisation. I'm sure some of you will know a lot about the history of the organisation. I'm sure some of you will know less. And I'll try to give some context throughout. I'll try to situate what I'm talking about in the bigger international picture as well while I go along. And all of this research, I should add, is based on archival and documented evidence. So if any of you have anecdotal evidence or have stories that you've heard or remember things, whether it corroborates or conflicts, please do let me know. I'd be interested to hear about that. So, as most of you will know, the British Met Office was founded in 1854 as part of the Board of Trade in the UK, which was quite standard for national meteorological services set up in that period. Belgium was set up slightly before, the US around the same period. Most of them were connected to economics and trade organisations. In 1919, because of the growth of both civil and military aviation, the Met Office was moved under the control of the newly formed Air Ministry. And by the end of World War II, the Met Office was playing a significant role in military and government departmental operations, and it was providing services to some specialist interest groups, such as mariners and farmers. Driven by meteorological technologies and the ideological notion that the Met Office should serve all of the British taxpayers who funded its existence, rather than just specialist interest groups, in the post-war years, the organisation's role as a civil agency providing services designed to protect the British public expanded greatly. Although in the early development of public weather services, a key aim of senior Met Office meteorologists had been to educate the public and promote the discipline of meteorology, the public actually preferred to focus on the utilitarian aspects of the forecast. And so public demand influenced the supply and quickly shifted the focus of the Met Office's public weather service provisions. Beginning with the adoption of a cost-benefit analysis approach in 1954, and influenced by international practices, especially those of the US Weather Bureau and the German Deutsche Wetterdienst, throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, the Met Office adopted corporate language and techniques which allowed it to show the efficiency of services and justify its expansion. So before I go further, I just wanted to start with the Met Office today, and hopefully when I show these things, they'll all just refresh your memory of where the organisation is today, and then when I go back into the post-war years, we can probably see some antecedents of some of these areas. So in the financial year 2011-2012, the Met Office made an operating profit of 9.1 million. And in 2012-2013, it made an increased operating profit of 12.3 million. The size of this figure, and even the fact that the organisation operates in such a commercial manner, often surprises many members of the public that I speak to. Another area of my research, I'm involved a lot with speaking to communities and understanding their experiences of weather, recording their memories of living with the weather. And often when I speak to those kind of groups, and this might come up in questions or conversation, they're very surprised that this is how the Met Office operates. And obviously, since 1996, the Met Office has operated as a government trading fund, a quasi-governmental status which in its statute requires the organisation to act commercially. And rather than just focusing on these top-level figures, so we can go a bit beyond that and just look at the breakup of the current revenues for the Met Office. So this graph here shows that in 2012-2013, it was about 15% of total revenues of the Met Office that were in the commercial sector, rather than for services rendered to other government departments. And so we should explore beyond simple top numbers like that. And as we look into the history, we'll see that it's not very useful to really just think about things as commercial meteorology or government contracts. And throughout the history of the organisation, we see that it's a lot more blurred, the boundaries between those two areas. And so today I hope to show that to understand the role that the Met Office has played and continues to play in commercial weather services, we cannot consider the organisation's provision of products, whether for government departments or commercial organisations, in isolation from the organisation's mandate to collect meteorological data and produce emergency forecasts. Indeed, as I will hopefully highlight in the next 40 minutes or so, the history of applied meteorological services at the Met Office and the emergence of a more corporate identity for the organisation in the 1980s and 1990s is inextricably linked with the organisation's post-war expansion and the creation of public weather services. By critically analysing the operations of the organisation in the period 1945 to 1965, we can see that the Met Office's involvement in commercial services long predates trading funds and operating profits, and has had a defining influence not only on the current Met Office services, but also on private weather markets in the UK and internationally. So, meteorology, like many other scientific disciplines, has a long history of trying to educate the layman in at least the basics of its theories and practices. In the first half of the 20th century, attempts at educating the general public were usually through printed books or pamphlets, and these were often written by individual meteorologists, and they were often driven by a sort of a kind of paternalistic drive to disseminate what they do to the wider public. And they were, driven by an ambition to pass on this utility that one could gain from a basic understanding of weather systems. In addition, in these texts, one can often detect a desire to raise the profile of the discipline, verifying meteorology's newfound professional status. But during the post-war years, as Met Office developments made during the war were integrated into a peacetime setting, the utility of meteorological forecasting, both for a specialist and for general users, significantly increased. Through these developments came a renewed desire to educate the general public, and a realisation of the great benefit public weather services could provide for many areas of everyday life. So before I go any further, I just thought I'd show a short video. I think we're having a couple of problems with the sound, which is a shame because it's got a lovely post-war feel to the narration of this video, and with a great received pronunciation throughout. But the images themselves are quite striking. As you'll see at the bottom, this is British Pathé. So this was a newsreel video. It was shown in 1959 across cinemas across the UK. Unfortunately, we don't have too many more details. There's no, at the Pathé archive, there's no actual written documentation of who made it, when exactly it was filmed and things like that. So this was targeted to a general public audience, an audience who didn't yet have televisions because it was shown at the cinemas. The title itself should give you some of the context that this video was played in. This is, let me just get it up now. I'll talk while the images are moving. Okay, so this, as I say, shows the practice of forecasting in the period. And it talks about introducing the public to the new computation methods being used. And as you'll see here, these are punch card machines, and we have some synoptic maps and showing the plotting. But the undertone to this video is about how the huge funding and the military funding of computer technologies that had been developed through the war and beyond were being used for peaceful purposes, and how everybody could benefit from the new systems and new technologies being implemented. And so there's this Cold War kind of tension running underneath the video, right from the title onwards. And it's familiarising people with the process, and also, in a sense, reassuring them that the humans are still doing the forecasting. If you notice, it shows them hand-drawing maps still and things like that. And there was some concerns at the time about computation within meteorology. So some quite interesting images. And there's possibly disproportionately a lot of women in the shots. Staff figures for the period probably show it was much more like 20% maybe. But there was, in certain departments, computation and other things, there was higher levels. And then it finishes with some nice funny stories about trying to predict whether there's going to be a pea super. He makes a joke about the pavement cracking like the Preston bypass at this point, actually. So at the moment, I'm trying to find out a bit more about the video. I have a sneaking suspicion that it also might have been shown in the US, because British Pathé had links with Pathé News in the US, but I'm not sure on that yet. But I thought that'd be a nice way just to sort of introduce some of the context in this period of things that were happening and going on. So in the immediate post-war years, the Met Office sought to capitalise on these wartime developments in meteorological forecasting, new techniques that had been developed under the duress of war. And they sought to sort of capitalise on these and shift them into a peacetime setting. Where can we apply these technologies? How can we use them in our normal operations? And this transition presented many challenges, and senior figures at the organisation were keen to capitalise on the successes and ensure that the organisation continued to expand. So during the war, the Met Office went through a huge expansion. It went from figures around several hundred of staff to about 3,000 staff at the end of the war. And actually in the post-war years there was a slight drop-off as many people who were demobilised. A lot of those staff were military contracts. So there was a slight drop-off, but the senior figures of the organisation in that period wanted to make sure that they remained much more in the thousands of staff rather than going back to the pre-war sort of numbers around 500. So the organisation had long advised other government departments and some British businesses and the military on both a free and commercial basis. One-off ad hoc inquiries were usually provided free of charge, such as a farming business looking to expand into new regions asking for climatological statistics on the area, whilst repeat services were usually charged for, albeit at an often highly subsidised rate. In this period, in the years immediately after the war, little, if no distinction was made between government departments, businesses and individuals who made inquiries. Decisions on whether to take on the work and projects were made largely within the framework of post-war reconstruction. So a lot of the decisions were kind of along the lines of, would providing this steel factory with frost warnings increase productivity for the nation? Can creating a road forecast in partnership with the AA help reduce the number of accidents and keep the country moving? So a lot of the decisions were made were about benefit for a whole nation in the rebuilding process. And during these initial post-war years, as Met Office developments were integrated, as these developments from the war integrated into the peacetime setting, the utility of the forecasts increased significantly, and through these developments came the possibility that applied weather services may be a benefit to more than traditional big user groups. So at this period, in about 1945, it's mainly the military, aviators and mariners who were using the forecasts. And so they started to expand beyond these three user groups. And amongst the upper echelons of the Met Office, there was a realisation beginning to emerge that more general weather services may be able to provide benefits for many areas of British life. Further, they realised that the opportunity to speak directly to the public could also allow the agency to continue growing and thriving. And by seeing the authoritative role the Met Office already took in many government advisory contexts, expanding across the other areas of British society. So this graph here kind of crudely shows the number of specialised services that the Met Office were providing in the period. And you can see the split between commercial and government. Now that split is an artificial split I've made by reading through what each of the services were. So I've placed that on it. There was no distinction made in the annual reports between commercial or government. In fact, in the annual reports, the listing of services was split up. There was a list of military services, a list of navy services, a list of aviation services, and then all of these came under the category forecasts for the public, government departments, the press, etc. So as you can see, they hugely increased after the war period, and there's a huge range of kind of services they're providing in this period, from forecasts for the Olympics in London in '48, forecasts for the Milk Marketing Board, all kinds of things being provided, but often very ad hoc process that's created them. So the reforms at the Met Office in the post-war years were seen by senior figures as an opportunity to develop the organisation's profile and prominence in civilian life. So in the period from 47 to 55, Met Office forecasts and warnings specifically tailored for government departments, public authorities and industrial concerns increased, as we can see here. But as I say, the increase lacked a formal structure and its distribution was not homogeneous. There was no big policy that sought to structure this development and growth. And the implementation of these forecasts and some of the warning services developing was an organic process in which the Met Office responded to an inquiry by an organisation. And beyond major new forecast or warning services created after this kind of inquiry, nearly all other business inquiries in the period were dealt with in largely the same manner as public inquiries. That is, that where possible, they were directed to the closest local or regional centre, which most commonly in this period was an RAF outstation, where the primary role of the Met Office staff there was to collect observations and to brief aviators. So in 1950, 9,000 people contacted their local RAF forecasting outstation by telephone. By 1955, this figure had gone from 9,000 in 1950. 1955, this figure was 70,000. So you can see the kind of increase in public uptake during that period, and that's just people telephoning their RAF outstation. It wasn't too uncommon for people just to turn up at their RAF outstation, right from businesses, which were generally welcomed, right through to sort of someone saying, "I've got my daughter's wedding in 3 weeks, can you tell me what's going to happen?" So the images here are a little bit later than that period, but early 60s, I think, these images. And these are at RAF Lynham in Wiltshire, which has just recently closed, I think, in the last few years. And we can see the instrument enclosure with an aeroplane in the background, and we can see a pre-flight briefing going on here. So in 1953, so in the middle of that 5-year period I just gave, in 1953, after the former director, Sir Nelson Johnson, left due to ill health, which itself seems to have been brought on by the stress of 15 years at the head of the organisation. And bearing in mind, he was in charge during that growth period through the war as well. He's an interesting figure. He was said to sleep under his desk for the whole war period. He only used to go home at weekends, and he had a roll-up mattress under his desk and used to stay there. So for 5 years, that was his life. And then he retired in 53. He developed Parkinson's disease, but the early onset seems to be caused by stress. So anyway, he was on his way out, and at the time, the organisation's got back up to about 3,000 staff. So the Air Ministry announced the appointment of the new director, and this was Oliver Graham Sutton. A mathematician and meteorologist, Sutton had previously worked for the Met Office, and by the time of his appointment in 1953, he already sat on several committees directing the organisation. And by the time he came back to the Met Office, he was an academic meteorologist. And on the several committees he was involved, along with several other academic meteorologists, he'd already previously to his appointment been quite vocal about their opinion on where they think the organisation should be heading. So you can see a bit of a shift in this period from military-trained meteorologists running the organisation through to university and academic-trained meteorologists in the organisation. So Sutton began as director in September 1953 with a clear and forthright agenda for the organisation's reform. He wanted the Met Office to continue its growth and to achieve funding increases at a time of continued government austerity. He believed he had to make the organisation relevant to every tax-paying individual. Sutton's agenda wasn't a huge departure from Johnson's before him, but Johnson's had been ad hoc development, and the public-oriented services had come about in that kind of organic way that I spoke of. And so Sutton gave a new impetus, an ideological grounding, and a consistent policy to many of the changes that had already been occurring since the war. And although Sutton put forward reforms for all aspects of the organisation, he considered that certain areas, such as services for military and research, to already be well established. And one of Johnson's big achievements is to set up the research arm of the organisation, in 1940, which was, he got the funding for that largely because of the need for new services throughout the war. So the focus of the development Sutton wanted to do was to be these services for the general user and for new sectors such as agriculture and other recreational groups. And prior to starting in September, so Sutton had this little gap. He finished his job lecturing, and he had a little bit of a gap, so he decided to go over to the US Weather Bureau and to look at how they were running their National Weather Service. So when he began at the Met Office, he circulated an informal report on his findings from his visit to the US. And in this, he set out the key areas that would go on to become the central parts of his tenure. And although Sutton's desire to improve public services in the UK was clearly influenced by this visit to the US, you can see many of the services adopted he takes straight from the US system. His lack of a demarcation between provision for public and small businesses and the latter's expansion, the expansion of these areas during his direction. So basically, sorry, I lost my way a little bit there. Sutton was influenced by a lot of these things, but in the US, the way they managed public and commercial services was very different. And so whilst he took many of the best ideas for services to implement, how he managed them was very different. He managed them together. He didn't consider general user services separate from businesses. So unlike the Met Office's near monopoly on weather services in the UK, by the early 1950s, a more market-led approach had begun to emerge in the US. The development of a nascent private weather market for services in the US had been boosted in 1953 by a publication of an influential US Weather Bureau report called Weather is the Nation's Business. And in this report, the US Weather Bureau set clear boundaries for areas and services where they should get involved, and stated clearly that the US government believed most applied services were the realm of private meteorological services. And to quote directly from it, they said, "The issuance of severe storm warnings endangering life or widespread damage to property are and should remain the function of government. But special services to industries to affect economies in their operation must be the province of the private practitioner." So here we see that kind of divergence of these weather services that have worked quite closely and continue to have close connections. And connected to the wider economics going on at the time. The US is in a boom period, a real neoliberal ideology emerging, whereas the UK is still in a war recovery mode. So this is kind of the divergence there. So the shift of Met Office services should be considered to be influenced by the US, but be viewed rather more as developments in a wider international picture, which saw the role and services of national meteorological services becoming more standardised, with the World Meteorological Organization providing an international forum which acted as a conduit for ideas between member states. The period saw a standard model of a weather service further defined and transposed to other countries who were still developing services. This professionalised model increasingly placed an emphasis on two emerging roles of the weather service. Firstly, a nation's weather service should, if not already doing so, extend its operations beyond traditional areas, such as aviation and marine services, to ensure that all sectors of society could benefit. And secondly, the Meteorological Service should consider the economic benefits of its services, highlighting how its programmes aided the nation financially. One of the countries that really led with that progression was Germany. And in 1956, the president of the Deutsche Wetterdienst, Dr. George Bell, championed both of these emerging ideas in a public address in Germany. But this address was quite interesting. It was translated into several different languages and circulated. So staff at the Met Office received a translation of his address. And in this address, Dr. Bell gave empirical cost-benefit analysis examples for each of the DWD's operational areas. And at this period, they were operating in more sectors than any other international national weather service. They were operating in aviation, shipping, agriculture, industry and power, and health. And in this speech, he gives a clear economic incentive for government investment in the DWD, and he strongly advocated meteorological applications that could benefit all sectors of society. So one of the first big changes that we can see when Sutton came in happens in early 1954. This is a project already underway before Sutton comes in, and it was given priority by Sutton and fast-tracked. This was the launch of, or the relaunch of TV weather services on the BBC. And the main difference, many of you may be aware, in January 1954, when this new format launched, the big difference was that there was now a meteorologist on screen. And the key thing that the Met Office had pushed in this whole process was that would be a Met Office member of staff. And there was some period where it seemed uncertain that was going to be the case, but the Met Office stood its ground in those debates. And here we have, the top right, we have the very first face of the weather on BBC, which is George Cowling. And here we have the very second face of the weather on the BBC, which is Tom Clifton. Tom Clifton didn't last too long, actually, I think, but George Cowling was on for several years. Interestingly, both of these had previous careers at the Met Office. The Met Office and the BBC jointly had open auditions with Met Office staff for people who wanted to transfer to this new job. They auditioned 33 people. The final report has a comment from a BBC administrator that says, only 3 of these are probably just about good enough. And they end up choosing 2. And they had a real problem with the disconnect between how a forecasting meteorologist at the time would speak and how a member of the general public would speak. And the BBC spent a lot of time, especially with George Cowling, working on his language, working on how he described things. And some of the debates that happen around deterministic and probabilistic language today can be traced right back to that first project, where you have these conversations where they're kind of saying, there's a 70% chance of rain, and the BBC person says, you can't say that. And so the very first forecast that went out, George Cowling actually, he said, and there's a chance of rain tomorrow afternoon, but it's going to be later on. So housewives, you can get your washing out early, was the language he used, and that kind of became quite emblematic of the approach that was adopted. And the development of the TV services grew out of genuine concerns over the lack of availability of forecasts for the general public. And these concerns were very well founded. In 1950, the Met Office's most popular and successful public-facing service had ceased to exist, and this was the radio service AirMet. AirMet had been operating since 1932. It was the Met Office's own radio broadcast nationwide on long wavelength radio. It was a cycling hourly programme, and each broadcast gave the listener an airfield weather report, an outlook of the current weather, commentary by the duty forecaster, and other weather station reports, including warnings. And although it was called AirMet, in the period before it was actually axed, it was shown to be hugely popular across all sectors of society. There was one passionate article trying to save the service that said we shouldn't call it AirMet, we should call it Haughty-Met, Pickney-Met, and all these other titles. But unfortunately, in 1950, due to a European agreement on the reallocation of radio bandwidth, the service ceased to exist. And so there was an understanding in the organisation that they'd lost their biggest way of communicating with the general public. And then in 1953, as many of you will be aware, I even saw there's a picture of it down in the foyer downstairs, the lack of an efficient channel to disseminate forecasts to the public had been tragically highlighted by the North Sea floods in late January. These floods caused 307 deaths is the official count. My research puts it at about 400, just over 400. 32,000 acres of land flooded, over about 102 coastal breaches of defences along the east coast. This image here is Canvey Island, or what remained of Canvey Island. The storm passed through the evening of the 31st into the 1st of February. This picture is an aerial shot from the 2nd of February. So it shows the sort of scale of the devastation. The other point probably to raise with Canvey Island is the storm surge hit Canvey Island around 1:10 a.m. The first landfall on the east coast had been at Spurn Head in Yorkshire at about 4 p.m. So it wasn't a hugely fast-moving system, and it had progressed, it had gone down the whole East Coast. But as each community dealt with the deluge themselves, and as communications were knocked out, phone lines were taken out, there was no opportunity and no ringing down to the next communities. So a lot of the deaths could have actually been avoided, and it was quite clear afterwards that they could have been avoided by some very simple systems being in place to be able to pass on the information along the coast. And the Met Office forecast actually wasn't hugely divergent from what occurred. The scale was possibly underpredicted. Part of the problem was the lack of understanding of how dilapidated a lot of the defences were. A lot of the defences had been actually turned from physical defences to stop water into defences to stop the Germans, and had not ever been converted back. So when there was a shortage of concrete and steel, a lot of physical sea defences had actually been turned into pillboxes and other things. And so out of this came a big government inquiry, a committee and a report known as the Waverley Report, after its chair, Viscount Waverley. It's a very interesting report, if that's what floats your boat. These government reports, it had what I'd like to call a proto-version of cost-benefit analysis language. We were already seeing the German DWD kind of using this kind of language, and it's one of the first government reports that really starts to talk about different options of what we could do, what each one will cost, and how much each one will save. Interestingly, after this flood, the defences were built to a 1 in 250 year level. At the same time, the Netherlands, which had a lot more devastation, rebuilt most of their defences to a 1 in 2,000 year level. So it shows us kind of different solutions there. Obviously, the Netherlands had a lot more invested in this kind of flooding, coastal flooding with their reclaimed areas. So the creation of new forecasts on TV and radio, and a central role in a plethora of new public warning services that came out of this flood, all meant that by the mid-1950s, on top of their traditional specialist services, the MO had expanded and were now becoming a publicly recognised civil agency. Before the war especially, but even in the immediate years after the war, a lot of the general public wouldn't be aware who the Met Office were. But by this period, by the mid-1950s, with the faces on television to connect to the forecast, with high-profile events and new warning systems that were set up in the aftermath of these events, they become a much more publicly recognised service. So influenced by developments in Germany, the US, extreme events in the period, and a need to justify the continuing growth of their budget at a time of ongoing government austerity, the Met Office increasingly began to highlight the efficiency and the utility of each new service it provided. The Met Office information pamphlet, Your Weather Service, shown here, was first printed in 1950, and it dedicated 1 of 4 sections to detailing the different weather services the Met Office currently provided. Further, it contained an appendix which showed you the approximate costs for each of these services and stated, when a weather factor enters into some manufacturing process or into some special undertaking connected possibly with business or sport, the trifling cost of a special forecast or a series of forecasts is often a sound investment. By 1959, the Met Office had begun another series of free educational leaflets on meteorological services, and again detailing the kind of services that customers could purchase. So Sutton's vision for the future included a clear separation of public services from military and aviation, and the establishment of new public-facing regional offices, and the centralisation of major departments in a new headquarters to be built in Bracknell. All of these proposals would be costly, and the budget had already been growing, so the Air Ministry convened a departmental committee to review Sutton's proposals and perhaps propose their own slightly cheaper version of the way to move forward. Their report was known as the Brabazon Report, and it made 32 recommendations for the future of the Met Office. And for the most costly of Sutton's ideas, which was the creation of regional weather centres, the report didn't provide outright support. It didn't have any ideological objection to the idea of a regionalised structure, but it just said that there wasn't sufficient funding. And it said that in time, if Sutton could show a cost-effective way of rolling out these centres, that there would be support, and that these local units that would serve the general user should be developed, that could provide detail beyond a national scale. So in increasing its role and mandatory responsibility for the protection of the public through warnings and extreme weather services, whilst also creating more non-essential public services, the cost for which had to be justified to the Treasury, the Met Office began to develop other models for funding services. Whilst they had always charged an often small fee to businesses or individuals who approached them for support, they now began to proactively go out and seek these contracts. In line with these developments, a disconnect between the personal face being promoted through the Public Services Department and an organisational identity that began to look less like that of a civil agency, more like that of a corporation, began to emerge. Nothing encapsulates the paradox at the heart of Met Office provisions in the period more than the creation of Sutton's regional weather centres. Without explicit support for the weather centres from the Brabazon Committee, and amidst concerns that they would be costly, and a step backwards for a discipline that was seen as increasingly moving towards automation and the use of mass telecommunications and broadcasting, it took Sutton 3 years to justify the importance of these centres and to budget for their creation. In doing so, he repeatedly expounded the centres as places where both the public and regional businesses could get advice that went beyond the routine forecasts. Sutton viewed the development of the centres not in conflict with the increasing automation of services, but rather as an extension of this trend. One day he said that each regional centre would create its own specialised forecast for regional television, radio and telephone. So the first centre, the London Weather Centre, opened its doors in August 1959. The premises were at Prince's House, Kingsway in Holborn, which is it was a coincidental opportunity that Sutton seized upon. It was a government building. The London Forecasting Office was already across the road, but not with public access. There was a shop front unit empty in this government building. Sutton said, right, we want that. We want to move the London Forecasting Office over there. So he was quite creative in how he managed to get this first centre open. This picture is actually of the second location. They moved after about 2 years. The centre moved slightly. So the original centre included all of the things that had been in Sutton's initial vision and reports that he'd written. And this had a forecast broadcasting space, a room for interviews with inquirers from businesses, a general inquiries information desk, and large window displays so the passing public could see the forecasts. And here we see the various aspects of it. This is the general inquiries desk at the bottom. So this is kind of anyone could walk up to this desk with your inquiry. Then a decision would be made. If you had a substantial forecast that you were willing to pay for, you'd be taken into the private room and then you'd have a consultation on what service you required. If it was a more sort of, again, my daughter's wedding's in a few weeks, then you'd be dealt with at the desk. As the London Weather Centre was a more publicly accessible version of the already hugely popular London Forecasting Office, it came as no surprise to those involved in the project that it was an immediate success. By 1958, the London Forecasting Office had been receiving about 90,000 inquiries a year. And within 4 years of the London Weather Centre opening its doors, they were now receiving 200,000 inquiries a year. So Sutton had proven that the format for a public and business-orientated regional office could work. And so soon after, offices were opened in Glasgow in 1959, Manchester in 1960, Southampton in 1961, and they would go on expanding into the 1980s when I think they peaked at around 15 or 16 regional centres. Retrospectively, several years later, Sutton stated that the creation of these centres had been driven by the inability of the local aviation forecasting centres to cope with the volume of public inquiries. And by 1963, the Met Office was receiving 800,000 public inquiries a year, with many of the forecasting, the RAF outstations and other regional centres like that unable to cope. Then that's why the regional centres expanded. I've got the number here. Sorry, they peaked at 13 in the 1980s, so there was 13 regional centres eventually. So the rapid growth in inquiries, coupled with the regional weather centres' direct contact with the consumer, gave the Met Office and particularly the Public Weather Services Department, which was then Met Office 18, gave them insight into which sectors of society were utilising forecasts by region and by time of year. An analysis of user data enabled the Met Office to begin identifying ever smaller user groups, such as horticulturalists and gardeners, and then they could further tailor services and separate commercial avenues from more generalised free public services. Reflecting the increase in consumer society in the post-war period, the Met Office increasingly began to refer to customers rather than users, and to separate these commercial services from those that they had to provide as part of the government's sovereign responsibility to protect civilians. Whilst it effectively operated a monopoly on weather services during the period, by increasing its public-orientated services and commercialising them where possible, to the general user, to the man on the street, the member of the public, the Met Office became simply another organisation providing another product. By mid-1962, as the huge number of data coming from these regional weather centres was accumulating, the Met Office produced a report on these figures and trying to show the economic benefit of all these services. The report produced from this data showed that an extremely diverse range of customers, from public utilities to banana importers, were now reliant on Met Office services to save their organisation substantial costs. So Met Office daily forecasts that were tailored for a specific client needs was saving businesses anywhere from £100 to £1,000 per week, this report argued. And furthermore, extreme weather warnings had helped farmers save entire crops worth thousands of pounds, and Met Office services for public utilities had saved the Gas Council alone several £million in the previous year. And the interesting thing in this report on economic benefits of the services is that it doesn't treat the different user groups distinctly. So money saved by the Cardiff banana importer, who was paying for air temperature forecasts for his transatlantic shipping route, was considered alongside the money saved for farmers from the storm warning services, which were a mandatory part of Met Office provision. So just to summarise, by the mid-1960s, we see that the Met Office has a well-recognised public profile, which is increasingly corporate in its identity. And it's operating with a large degree of autonomy from central government. The organisation was now referring to users, clients and products, and was attempting to justify its services through studies of costs and benefits. Whilst many areas of the Met Office remain largely unchanged in their traditions and structure, the public profile and commercial services of the organisation, promoted by senior staff and the Public Services Department, plays an important role. They're unrecognisable from the operations immediately after the war. The network of military men and scientific civil servants, which emerged out of the Second World War, have now been replaced by university-educated meteorologists who are also conversant in the language of business and public relations. The ability to act, speak and be perceived as one coherent corporate body was of great benefit to the Met Office, increasing its prominence and inserting its position as a source of scientific expertise in British society. So, just a few concluding points. A cursory reading of the post-war period and the development of commercial services in the UK and at the Met Office highlights how early expansion into services that in the US were deemed the realm of private market furthered the Met Office's central position, furthered a monopoly, and could said to be have stifled the emergence of other private services in the UK. And that's influenced by a huge amount of factors. Like I said, you can't look at that without looking at the national context. High start-up costs for private services, the infrastructure already in place, and the national policies of the time, especially the Labour government immediately after the war. However, a closer reading shows that the Met Office developed these services, how the Met Office developed these services is just as important as the fact that they did. The lack of a clear demarcation between general public services and specific applied services afforded a creative approach within departments at the Met Office, meaning that the development of commercial services interacted with and was often influenced by other initiatives, such as TV forecasting, high street consultancy spaces, and it benefited from often subsidised costs as it was part of these other programmes. So the development of TV services is a great example where it's seen as a public service, a general user service. It's seen as being funded directly by that. But through the development of new mapping techniques that they used on television, testing new ways, they developed services for businesses that were improved for businesses that were subsidised through the TV project. The Met Office's early role in the expansion of commercial services is key to understanding not only the organisation's continued prominence in this area today, but also the position of the UK as a nation and other UK companies in general as world leaders and internationally renowned providers of commercial and applied weather services. So I'd just like to finish. That's everything I'm going to talk about the Met Office, so thank you. I'd just like to finish with a quick plug for the project I'm currently working on, which some of you may be interested in. It's called Snow Scenes, and for the last few months we've been collecting people's memories of past snow and winters in Cumbria. We're hoping to expand the project. We're working with Aberystwyth University as well to look at the similar project in North Wales, but we're hoping to expand it beyond that as well. And we're exploring how place, tradition and memory plays a role in local understandings of climate and extreme weather. So we're looking a lot at how communities understand past extreme winters, whether they consider it part of their normal climate in the region, whether they consider it an outlier, those kind of questions. This is an image. I created a series of images. We've been working with a couple of local museums and community centres in the region. And they had an archive of 3,000 images that they had no information about. So they want to promote the public, giving them information about these images. So I went through, found all the ones that related to cold weather and winter, and then tried to locate them all, and ended up taking pictures of the same places today and made these composite images, which have just been on exhibition in Kendal, which finished this weekend actually. But if you're interested in the Snow Scenes project, look it up. We've got a blog, we're on Twitter. We're at the point now where we're trying to connect the community memories to meteorological records from the region, to other understandings from the same period. So yeah, please ask me if you'd like to know more about that, and thank you for listening. Thank you.